Well, I've put up what might seem to be a slightly opaque statement in the quote from Seamus Heaney, much lamented, deceased poet. "Conquest is a lie. I grow older, conceding your half-independent shore, within whose borders now my legacy culminates inexorably." Is this a personal statement about a relationship? Is it a political statement? Is it a statement, a universal statement about power relationships? One of the issues I think that we face in our discussion of our sector is that of the absence of geography. In economic policy, in arts policy, a lack of debate, really, on the models, the geographical models, the funding geographical models that we have. And they've been raised already today, not least in the Shadow Minister's speech. But as well as the absence of geography, there's also arguably an absence of equity and an absence of transparency, sometimes about data. I've put together this table. Forgive me for the TBCs. I didn't manage to find this data from the sources I was using. Probably in time we'll manage to get them. But I think one of the things that comes through very strongly there is that not far short of 3/4 of arts funding is decided centrally on the first three categories. And the fourth one, which is local government, is the one that is hit hardest at the moment and is most rapidly diminishing, with significant implications. Now, we are the country with the most centralised funding system in the arts of any in Europe, as was revealed recently in the Rebalancing Our Cultural Capital report. We also look here at the per head of population allocation of budgets from that same report. And I won't spend too long going through the data in detail, but I think you'll see a very, very consistent pattern there. Massive allocation to London per head of population, and really very tiny, relatively speaking, per head of population allocations to the whole of the rest of England. And I would stress this data is for England, and that report, Rebalancing Our Cultural Capital, was England only. If you look at DCMS Treasury funding, for example, £49 per head of population for London, £1 just over. Now, I think one should say that, and has been pointed out by the Tate and others since this report was published, that we have, of course, got national institutions outside London, Tate, Liverpool being a very clear point from where we are at the moment. So the data isn't exactly representing what's happening in London and outside London. I'll come back to the data about private philanthropic and business giving later. However, having acknowledged the fact that some of the London-based nationals do operate significantly outside the capital, with touring exhibitions, for example, we need to set against that the reality that if there is not an opportunity to express culture locally, to be creative with cultural resources locally, and to become increasingly dependent on resources that are sent from London, in England's case, then the whole cultural activity of a community or a region is impoverished. And one national museum, for example, has reported that a local partner, a significant museum, could not take up a free show because it did not have the staff or resources to install it in its own institution. And the HLF is also reporting that it is becoming increasingly difficult for organisations which have had their stage 2 pass to actually find the matching funding to enable them to take forward their projects. We also, I think, need to acknowledge that when it comes to fundraising and funding in our museum sector, that we have a very different picture for different kinds of museums. Now, again, this is a piece of work which very kindly the staff of the Museum Association undertook on my behalf just in the last few weeks. And I think we would say that this is very much work in progress. 13 nationals and 13 non-national museums were surveyed, or at least responded to a request for information, for their funding a decade ago and the funding now with inflation adjusted for. As you can see, the 13 nationals identified a 6% drop in real terms of funding. and the HLF funding for the sector had increased significantly. On average, the 26 museums had dropped by 5%. And again, you'll see as you look down the list there that local authority museums overall appeared to have done well out of the 10-year development. However, if you take the MPMs out of that, a very different picture appears. And the local authority museums, and I would acknowledge here and say this is work in progress, the very small number of local authority museums in England that had responded, had actually had a very hefty loss of income in real terms during the decade. It was also pointed out by some of the respondents that if we had taken a mid-date in this period, shall we say 9 to 10 or 10 to 11, we probably would have found that the drop from then to 2012 to 13 to have been much more significant as well. So I say there is a lot of work to be done on this, but I think nevertheless, this is an example of the kind of data we need to start to be pulling together. And actually, when I say there's a lack of transparency, there's a lack of clear information available to us from public sources of what's going on. Arts and Business also looked at cultural organisations' funding over a 3-year period. This, I'm afraid, is the most recent data we have from Arts and Business on this. I won't dwell on this very long. All I would say is look at London and look, if you're not from London, at the region in which you live or work. And you'll see there the dramatic contrast in fundraising that's happening. Now, we all hope that the Catalyst programme will have some impact on this. I think we have to be realistic about how much impact it can have. And I think that what it says to us is that the imbalance there is in the public funding between the capital and the rest of England, and come to that, the United Kingdom, in the arts and business data, and the lack of balance there is in the private funding as well, adds up to double, triple whammies for many organisations. And this is specifically museum fundraising as opposed to cultural organisation fundraising. And again, look for London, look for your own region. Now, I would stress that, again, one of the difficulties of the data is that it doesn't actually identify the different kinds of institution in London. I strongly suspect that the great bulk of the money is going to the large London nationals, and that if you're a small local authority museum in London, you would be in no better position than in many other parts of the United Kingdom. But I'm afraid the data at the moment doesn't really give us the information to be able to analyse that. The MA's cut survey, which you've heard Mark talk about, found, as you can see, nearly 50% suffering a loss of overall income in the last year, an increase in interns and volunteers, again, of nearly 50%, over a third showing a decrease in staff, just over a quarter reducing their public free events, just under a quarter their temporary exhibitions, and about a third, again, reduced school visits too. In a separate piece of data on local authority spending, that data from local authorities showed that between 2010 and 2011, net current expenditure on museums fell by 11% in 1 year alone. That's local authority museums, of course. Wealth attracts wealth. Poverty begets poverty. The 85% of the population that lives outside at least the rich bits of the metropolis get, in relative terms, the crumbs from the table in every direction. That's the geographical inequity that we should be talking about. Now, you could argue that we are talking again as Sharon Ament said in the What Do the Nationals Ever Do For Us session earlier on today, that we shouldn't be talking about institutions, we should be talking about the public. Well, actually, the per head of population allocations directly does talk about the public. Now, Croydon has taken one route. The decision to remove items from the museum collection to sell them in a public auction is a clear breach of the museum's code of ethics, MA's code of ethics, and this was confirmed recently by the MA disciplinary panel, as a result of which I can announce today that Croydon will be barred from membership of the Museums Association. We will also call on the Arts Council to revoke Croydon's status as an accredited museum. I think many of us would regard Croydon's action as being a breach of trust, a breach of public service, and a breach of a threat to the future of the sector as well, because it will change the nature of the relationship between donors and museums for all of us, not just for Croydon. So I think that we should take this extremely seriously, as the MA has done, and we urge and call on the Arts Council, we hope, will do the same. I would also like to say, on the other hand, that support from HLF is there, and I'm not sure that everybody is aware of this fully, that HLF has got a new grants programme based on their consultation on their strategic framework, A Lasting Difference for People and Heritage, which is now being rolled out. One to note in this is their new transition funding grant programme to help greater resilience in heritage organisations that are undergoing transition. Now, this transition may be loss of regular revenue streams, it may be introduction of new governance models and management structures as well, and it provides previous HLF recipients with grants of between £10,000 and £100,000. This can help museums to review their business plans where necessary and help with mentor support. Also to identify ways of achieving greater sustainability. I believe that Fiona Talbot, the HLF's Head of Museums and Libraries, is here in the conference over these couple of days. I'm not sure if she's actually here in the... She is here in the conference. Would you mind standing up so people can see you, please, Fiona? There we are. I understand Fiona will be very happy to talk to you during the conference if you wish to do so. Has investment in London arts meant increased London public participation? The answer is that a slightly higher percentage of those who live in London do not engage with the arts at all than in the rest of England. And those who engage 3 times or more annually is more or less exactly the same as well. Now, this is extremely significant. If you think about the amount of investment you've seen in the data there, you would expect that to translate into extra participation. And that tells us that investment alone is not enough to change the game, and that we have to do something different. And I think that means museums have to be different to be successful. Now, we know plenty of museums across the UK, and including in London, that are very, very effective at reaching audiences. But what we're seeing here is that investment alone is not enough. It's got to be the right kind of museums, the right kind of participation. But it certainly does not give any ethical justification for the hefty investment in London, particularly the large London institutions. Where does this come from? Andy Haldane from the Bank of England was extremely honest in commenting on the 85% of all loans that banks made. They were to finance and property between 1997 and 2007. And he said there was a great sucking sound as both people and monies were drawn into banking. Industries outside of finance were starved of sunlight. Now, those industries, by and large, are across the rest of the UK. There are relatively few centres where the funding can be sucked into for finance. The economic consequences, the social consequences of that have been dramatic. The Milburn report says disadvantage and advantage cascade down the generations. An economic recovery in which only the top tier of society prospers, the middle and bottom stagnate or fall even more behind, is what he predicts. And that is what we are seeing. This is then a financial crisis. It's also a social crisis and a political crisis, and arguably, in a way, a democratic crisis. The global financial system is doing this sucking. It takes funding away from the visible world of streets, local communities, businesses, and even states. We have learnt that this financial system is not fully accountable to us as citizens, but in the museum sector, and as our visitors as a consequence as well, are experiencing the results of that. The result also has been across many parts of the UK, and I can say this for Cardiff, among others, that the creative industries, for example, the design industries, are gradually and slowly declining in Cardiff because of the huge pull of the creative sector in London. So what starts as a financial hegemony becomes a hegemony in all sorts of other ways as well. There is an urgent need for new localised economic and social models to bring employment and to keep investment for communities and to sustain community identities. And museums and galleries have to be part of that new model. without the funding to do so, as we've seen, their opportunity to be effective in that is extremely limited. It is interesting when you ask the public what they think of this growing gap in income levels. And it's very, very clear that a great majority of the population, when asked that specific question, feel that it's inequitable. We need to remind ourselves of our value. It's easy to lose sight of that when resources are being cut, particularly from institutions that are under great threat. Gillian Clarke, the national poet for Wales, had, I think, a lovely story here describing, I think, well, again, she's a poet, so she would say this beautifully. A poet in the classroom allows art to teach technique in a flash of joy. And she describes how she invited R.S. Thomas, the poet, into Cwmbran Comprehensive School. And she said that she recently met the mother of twin boys who were there, and she said they've never forgotten it. And another girl who was in the class, a dustman's daughter, was inspired to read English at Cambridge. Now, of course, going on to read English in Cambridge is not the only measure of inspiration and impact, but clearly that one occasion, that one event of a great poet giving his time, invited, as it turned, we now know, by another great poet, to come into a classroom and work with children was absolutely transformatory. Arts Council Wales consulted teachers in Wales on the role of arts in schools through a questionnaire. This data is, I think, quite extraordinary, really. How many questionnaires do you get back with 98 and 99% responses like this? That the participation in the arts for children improved their learner engagement by 99%, developed emotional well-being by 98%, developed interpersonal skills by 99%, and also contributed to reducing the impacts, not the poverty itself, but the impacts of poverty and disadvantage, again, nearly 90%. They also interviewed young people themselves. 471 children were interviewed between November last year and March this year. Key messages from them were the arts are important in their lives. They regretted the reduction in arts provision in schools as they got older. An overwhelming majority felt that the arts could teach things other subjects could not and offered alternative ways of learning. They recognised that the arts contributed to health and well-being. Now, sometimes you will read that there is no substantive evidence to support the impact of museums and galleries. It is not true. If we only listen to what our visitors say, if we only respect their testimony, and in this case it was teachers and schools, happened to be in Wales, if we are prepared to do that, the evidence is there all around us. It's in many, many forms, qualitative, quantitative. The only conclusion we can reach is that those who stand in front of that huge body of evidence and say there is no evidence are like Nelson with the blind eye to the telescope. They do not wish to see it. We can no longer operate as a sector on that basis. We must acknowledge that evidence. We must use that evidence. We must accept that evidence. This is a quote from David Hare, and I think it speaks powerfully to the need, actually, for everyone involved in the arts and culture to accept how significant our role, and in this case, again, it's a playwright writing, how significant our role can be. And as he says, what do school children need again? Access to hope, and most of all, access to convincing voices of hope. The challenge is to make those voices accessible again, wherever they now are. Well, it's part of our job to make the voices of hope accessible to children, to adults. I want to read to you from a school's prospectus. Our primary aim is to encourage each young person to be self-aware, inquiring, tolerant, to stand up for a greater purpose than themselves, and in doing so to be of value to society. With subjects ranging from Wagner to cookery, from journalism to agriculture and mechanics, the young people live and work in a rich environment. Academic study is important, but our view of education celebrates the creative, the physical, the spiritual, as much as the intellectual. Fulfillment which can readily translate into other areas of school life. Career choices like may take them along traditional paths to the city, law, medicine, the army and public service, but also in greater numbers to the media, the creative arts and entrepreneurial adventure. Now, that's a school in England. Credit to Michael Gove. I'm a critic of his, as you may have read in the journal recently. Credit to Michael Gove that schools exist in England that have such a breadth of view of the curriculum. There is just one slight problem with this. The school is Eton. Our comprehensive schools in England do not have that same opportunity. The arts and humanities are being demoted in the new curriculum, so sadly they will not be able to compete with Eton on those grounds. And I think that what I'm really trying to say here is that we have a vital role to provide the alternative curriculum for schools. And I've chosen schools just as one example for audiences. We could have chosen many others. We are vitally important. When times get hard, we are needed yet more by the communities, not just schools. We need a museum sector that is shaped for the current realities. To some extent, we still operate under the rules that were created for a different reality, going back to the 19th century, certainly the 20th century. We need a concept of cultural democracy in which the public are holders of culture and creators, not just consumer of cultural innovation, and co-partners in shaping services. We need a concept of public space, which is that it is creative and social, centres for public creativity, inclusive and welcoming, safe places. We need a concept of public service, so often derided as dull, worthy, old-fashioned, inefficient, expensive or self-serving, and a drain on the economy compared with the private sector. But the public sector actually stands up much better than that caricature would suggest. It's also about more than efficiency. It's about fairness, about long-term sustainability, and about social purpose. Public service has responsibility for the long-term well-being of communities and the people who live in them. We need a concept of cultural ethics too. Our cultural ethics, our ethical code for the MA and ICOM has served us well, but it is now not sufficient to meet the challenges of today and the future. And we are seeing that. The data shows us that. The funding data shows that. The ways of participation of audiences show that as well. We need to be stronger and clearer in defining our responsibilities to the public, to the communities of which we're a part. This is an individual responsibility for every single one of us in the room. We have an ethical responsibility. Grown-up professions expect individual professionals to stand up. That is what each of us must do. And therefore, I welcome the launch today of the Social Justice and Museums Group. The work that the MA has been doing on museums change lives. But we need to translate this into professional codes that actually have teeth. And that we've shown the teeth on the collection side. I don't yet see the sharpness of the teeth on our public responsibilities in other ways. We need to be founded in this ethics on equity and inclusion, explicitly do so. There is still far too wide a divergence of audiences among museums. And we need to be very specific about our wider social purposes, underpinned by research on our impacts. And local museums are crucial for this, absolutely crucial. For many of the poorest in our communities, they will not travel beyond the mile, 2 miles, 3 miles from where they live. And much though each of us who works in national museums will and should work to make it possible for those individuals to experience our collections and our work and our opportunities for creativity for them, the root and the foundation of all of this work is the local museums and the regional museums. As centres of community learning, for health and well-being, for community identity, for holding contemporary local cultures, for regeneration and economic health. And we are going to have to find a way in which the cultural is embedded within and alongside the economic and other areas of our work. And I would like to highlight for you the work, for example, of Carol Williams and the Centre for Research in Socio-Cultural Change, CRESC, which is now being looked at very seriously by the Welsh Government, and which focuses on trying to sustain funding and creativity and activity and jobs locally within communities, and not just waiting for the next big car plant to turn up and save everybody. We're a profession, I think nobody debates that, but are we more? The late Campbell Christie, who I didn't know, and really I know little more about him other than the fact of this quote, former General Secretary of the Scottish TUC, one of his guiding principles was that public service is an honourable thing to do and should always have people in need at its heart. So we're a profession, but we should also, no matter what kind of museum we work in, independent, national, local authority, university, armed services, whatever, we are also a public service with the deep responsibilities that brings. And I also want to ask, should we also not be a vocation? If our role in society and if our role in communities is, as certainly I have proposed, and is articulated in the Social Justice and Museums Group's manifesto, should we not also have that dedication that a vocation requires? And again, take on a personal responsibility, not just a collective corporate responsibility, for the impact of our work. A profession, a public service, a vocation. R.S. Thomas, the poet who Gillian Clarke invited into the classroom back in the 70s, put these words in the mouths of one of the subjects of one of his poems. Democracy is the tip the rich and the well-born give for your homage. This bleak view of the operation of democracy, of the failures of democracy, is one that we should not allow to stand. The evidence we've seen in terms of funding and other ways shows that massive injustice operates at the heart of a democratic society. It's our responsibility to make sure that that prediction does not come about. So some actions to conclude. A request, a plea for funding bodies to look at the whole picture of funding for the arts, museums, and then to shape policies that help us to redress the balance. Now, some funding bodies already are doing brilliantly on this, other ones are not. But we need all of the funding bodies, whether it's government-funded, trusts and foundations, corporates, whoever they are as funders, to recognise the inequity and to help us to change it. Secondly, the museum sector itself needs a much clearer view of its purpose, supported by research on impacts. And I would argue, this is my personal view, it's not the Museum Association's one, we do need to look at our code of ethics to try and put the public at the centre of it, to be a 21st century code of ethics that actually is fit for purpose for the challenges we face. And in all this, we need to look back at our history. Many of our museums had as their origins the commitment of mechanics institutes, literary and philosophical societies, natural history societies, in localities, in towns and cities, long before the state became involved in funding. Those people laid the foundations for a different kind of cultural opportunity, for a different kind of learning opportunity for citizens. They saw it as an inclusive process, one that should engage everybody in society, not just the better off. We stand on their shoulders. Only through their commitment and effort have we got the museums that we have today. It was part of an expression in a sense of local democracy that all these institutions that we now work in can exist. We owe it to those pioneers, our forebears, to develop as a sector the best possible case and the best possible work to ensure that those institutions can survive for public good. And I think that is our great challenge. Thank you.